We are really glad to welcome you to day 3 of our virtual Extension Master Gardener Coordinator Conference. So we had a great opening day. Yesterday we heard all about impact and evaluation. And if due to life or technology, yours or mine, you missed any of those sessions, I will put all the links in the chat box, but we have YouTube of all of the conference that has happened so far. So we will keep you up to date on everything that's happened. We've had great conversation going in the chat box already, a really excellent poster session today. So we're really excited to take the next step on our communication day. And I'm, without further ado, going to turn it over to our communications subcommittee, chaired by John Orrick from Purdue University. And he is going to be our MC for the day, kind of introducing the speakers and sharing with you some of the great content that the communications team has prepared for you. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to be with you and share with you some of the things that the subcommittee, communication subcommittee for the EMG Coordinators National Committee has been working on. I just want to talk to you a little bit about our focus. Our focus as a subcommittee has been committed to increasing awareness and recognition of the EMG program across the country, and we do this through a website that has been redesigned, direct outreach through the monthly e-blast, annual e-mag, webinars and conferences like you're enjoying right now, and as well through social media on Facebook and more. So those just a few of the ways that we reach out and some of the things that we've been focused on. We meet on the second Monday of every month from 1 to 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'd love to have you join us. So if you're interested in this or you have particular experiences or skills that you would like to share with our subcommittee, you can see the members of our subcommittee there. Susan DeBleek from Iowa, Katie Dunker from Colorado, Missy Gable from California, Bill Lester from Florida, and myself. So feel free to reach out to me and I'll be glad to get that connection information to you and you'll be able to join us in our efforts. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first set of speakers, both from Oregon State University, Master Gardener Program and Extension, Gail Langelotto and LeAnn Lochler. And first of all, Gail is a professor of horticulture at Oregon State University, where she has served as statewide program leader for the Oregon's Extension Master Gardener Program. And with her is LeAnn Lochler, who is a creative and communication strategist, consulting with national, regional nonprofits and institutions in the past, but is currently the statewide outreach program coordinator for Oregon State University Extension's Master Gardener Program. So with that, I'm going to allow Gail to go first.
Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'm going to provide a little bit of a rationale as to why this is really important to just step right into in Master Gardener programs, and LeAnn is going to talk about communication strategies for doing this work. I wanted to share a little bit about who we are, some of the identities that we claim. For myself personally, I'm half Italian, half Filipino, and I think that being biracial has given me a sensitivity to understanding different perspectives. I've also, prior to coming to Oregon, lived or worked in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., the South Bronx, and Sacramento, all cities with a great deal of diversity. And I also do think it's important that one of the things that allows me to do this work without fear is that I'm fully promoted and tenured. And I feel that that gives me a level of power, but also responsibility and a level of protection when talking about racial and social justice in Master Gardener programs. And I'll let LeAnn share a little bit about herself.
I grew up in the surf culture of Southern California, and I went to a predominantly Latino Catholic high school. I identify as a white cisgendered woman who is married to a woman who identifies as Latina. I identify as queer. I live in North Portland, in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Portland, and I've lived here for 20 years. I'm a homeowner, and with that, I feel a sense of privilege. My family includes I've married into a very large Mexican-American family, and my family includes Australian, Chinese, Thai, and we have a very large Greek contingent. And I'm also a master gardener.
Thanks, LeAnn. So you might be wondering, what do these two nice ladies have to tell us about communications related to social and racial justice and Master Gardener programs, particularly being that we're in Oregon, and Oregon has a reputation, at least from the outside, of being a fairly progressive state. If you know much about Oregon, perhaps you know that it's a fairly racially homogenous state as well. So much so that when I first took the position at Oregon State University, after just living in the South Bronx for several years, it was striking to me the difference in community makeup in Oregon. I ended up staying in Oregon because I fell in love with my husband, who is white and grew up in Oregon his entire life. And I kept asking him, like, where's the diversity here? Why is there such a lack of diversity? And he didn't have any answers. So when I saw that a PSU professor, Walida Imarasha, was conducting a roadshow on Oregon's hidden history, and the exact title of the presentation was, "Why Are There So Few Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History." And I made my husband, I made my stepkids, I was like, come on, we're all gonna go and learn something, because this was really something that I pondered about for quite some time. And what I learned was startling. In 1844, when the Provisional Government of Oregon was formed, it was formed so that slavery was outlawed, but there was specifically a racial exclusion clause in the Provisional Constitution of Oregon. It also included what is now known as the infamous Lash Law in that provisional constitution, which said that any Black, Chinese, or mulatto who remained in Oregon after their period of servantship ended, they had to submit to twice yearly lashings in public if they wanted to remain in Oregon. Importantly, I think that for our purposes, that provisional constitution prohibited land ownership. When Oregon was admitted to the State of the Union, the racial exclusion clause was baked into our Constitution, and that prohibition on land ownership remained. I think it's noteworthy to point out that that law was repealed in 1926, but the racial exclusion language was not removed from our Constitution until 2001, because there was a group that felt like it was very important history and heritage that needed to be preserved in Oregon's Constitution. Even though the 15th Amendment was passed in the United States in 1870, excluding any limits to voting based upon race, I think it's noteworthy to point out that Oregon did not ratify the 15th Amendment until 1959. And in 1922, Walter Pierce was elected governor of the state of Oregon. He was an openly KKK-endorsed candidate, and according to some scholars, he is the only governor known to be elected to the highest office in a state who actually was a KKK leader himself. So as you might imagine, this hidden history has had a big impact in determining the current makeup of who is an Oregonian who lives in Oregon. And recently, our public broadcasting system, Oregon Public Broadcasting, shone a light on this history and kind of tried to connect the dots between Oregon's past and our present racial makeup. So before I show these statistics, just keep in mind that across the United States, our country is 13% Black, 60% white, 19% Hispanic, 6% Asian, according to the last census. According to the last census in Oregon, we have a startling lack of diversity within the state. We still maintain a lot of the legacy of those past actions in determining the present makeup of our community. And when we talk about the Master Gardener program in Oregon, I think it's noteworthy that within the Master Gardener program within our state, the last time we took a demographic census, that in a very homogeneous state, our Master Gardener program is even more homogeneous. When I point out these numbers to Master Gardeners in our state, I really try to make it clear that what we'd like to do is take a data-driven approach to make sure that we are in parity with our communities, that we're representing our communities, that it isn't a quota system, but really it is a data-informed approach to try to figure out how we can approach programming. I think it's important to note that some of the Master Gardener volunteers in Oregon have received this information to think that, you know, we want white people to leave our program and that we want to bring more diversity in. We've really been trying to say what we want to do is open the doors wider, build a longer table, and we've decided that our focus will not be on that we'll focus on who's missing from our program and who do we need to make concerted efforts to invite to the table. I think it is important to note that history does play a role in present, and that what the example that I presented in Oregon is just one example. There are other examples that unfortunately could be drawn from different parts of our country. I would encourage everyone to learn about and contemplate how past racism in your state or region might affect the current makeup and status of your community, as well as your Master Gardener program. And when we talk about why this work is important, I think it's important to ask who's benefiting from our program, who could benefit but is missing from our program. We could also talk about what it means to be research-based or how folks perceive the term Master Gardener. And this topic of who has access to land is something that's going to come up repeatedly. First, I want to talk a little bit about who benefits from our program. Oh, on the land part, sorry, this is where I really wanted to do a land acknowledgement, which I think is important to consider who has land and why. I'm coming to you today from Albany, Oregon, which is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River, Oregon, Ampanifu Band of the Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, the living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. A lot of our programs really are focused on the idea that folks may have land to garden within, and I think it's something that we really need to be keenly aware of. But first next I want to go on to who benefits from our program, and here I really have to thank Sherry Dorn and colleagues for doing what was the first comprehensive survey of the demographics of Master Gardener volunteer programs in the United States. Here, I combine the data that Sherry and colleagues presented for statewide coordinators and county coordinators. 249 coordinators responded to the survey, and you can see that even within the leadership group of Master Gardeners, we're a fairly homogeneous group. Over 5,500 Master Gardener volunteers responded to the survey, and once again, I think it's important to note that it's a fairly homogeneous group. Another outcome of the survey that Dorn and colleagues conducted was that 76% of volunteers reported having higher income than the median income level. So fairly affluent and also more homogeneous than perhaps the communities where we could be working. In the same paper, Sherry and colleagues linked to data from the US Census Bureau of Labor Statistics to show that on a per capita basis, there is a tendency for whites to volunteer more than other races. However, one of the things that we oftentimes hear, or that I've heard in the past, is, well, we are serving diverse populations, they're just not volunteers within our program itself, or perhaps those groups are not interested in volunteering. The Census Data Bureau would indicate otherwise. And I do have to thank Sherry for repeatedly putting out the call for the resource repository, because I looked at it yesterday and found a really great study that was done on a focus group type approach to Latinos in Oregon. And in that paper, they noted that many Latinos do volunteer. They just don't consider it volunteering. It's just part of their natural approach. They consider it helping. I want to finish up my part of the presentation by talking about redlining and environmental justice, and really kind of calling out this idea of who has land and why. And to do that, I'm going to have to first introduce you to the concept of urban heat islands. If you haven't heard of an urban heat island before, it is this concept that urban areas tend to be 5.5 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than adjacent regions that are more rural. The reason that cities are hotter is because they contain more hardscape, impervious surface, which absorbs and re-radiates heat. They also lack vegetation, which can evapotranspire into the atmosphere and help to cool the atmosphere. Just this year, Jeremy Hoffman and Vivek Chandis at Portland State University published what I think is a really groundbreaking paper in the journal Climate. What they did is they looked at redlining laws of the 1930s. These redlining laws were sometimes called residential security maps, or HOLC maps for the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And how this worked is that neighborhoods were graded on a scale of A to D as either being best, desirable, declining, or hazardous. And perhaps it's no surprise to you that the declining and hazardous neighborhoods were ones which where more Black people lived. In the C and D neighborhoods, no home loans were extended. I think this is very important because this prohibited home and land ownership to large portions of the population. And since land is one of the primary factors associated with generational wealth, it really did handicap a lot of communities based upon these redlining decisions. So what Hoffman and Chandis did is they looked at 108 cities across 4 different sectors of the United States, and they looked to see how the HOLC maps might help predict current urban heat patterns. And that they found that across 108 cities, 94% of these cities had city-scale patterns of heat that were completely consistent with HOLC maps. Specifically, on a national level, they found that D neighborhoods were on average 4.7 degrees hotter than A neighborhoods, and that this was totally tied to an increase in impervious surface cover and a decrease in tree canopy cover. Hoffman and Chandis found that D neighborhoods were less able to resist development and were less able to preserve green space. In the West, the difference between a D neighborhood and an A neighborhood was 13 degrees Fahrenheit. So what was really mind-blowing to me is that 90 years later, we're still seeing the echoes of these HOLC maps. 90 years later, redline neighborhoods suffer higher heat loads. They host more food deserts. They lack land for gardening. And so much so can these HOLC maps predict where we are today, that for most cities in the United States, you can look at a heat map of the city. Here are 2 heat maps of Portland, Oregon, in the morning on the left, in the evening on the right. And you can just see where the D neighborhoods were by looking at the heat map 90 years later. So in Portland, it is North Portland where LeAnn resides. So I love the Master Gardener program. I wholeheartedly love the program. We do so many wonderful, amazing things. And I think that sometimes because we do so many wonderful, amazing things, it's sometimes more difficult to see the larger picture. What we're talking about here is a culture change if we truly want to address this issue. And as anyone who's worked in the Master Gardener program for a period of time knows, change can be hard in our program. I really love this quote from Eric Weiner from the Geography of Bliss. Culture is the sea we swim in, so pervasive, so all-consuming, that we fail to notice its existence until we step out of it. It matters more than we think. And then the last slide before I transition to LeAnn. I think it's important to normalize civil dialogue around difficult issues. If we're only showing up at times of crisis, folks are going to ask, well, where have you been? At best, our efforts are going to come off as disingenuous, and at worst, they're going to come off as performative. I think it's important when we're communicating about these issues to make sure we meet folks where they are as a regular practice, and to really think about how our communication channels either reach or fail to reach certain groups. And then finally, communication is important, but is meaningless unless we have the follow through to go with it. So with that, I'm going to hand off to LeAnn.
So the question then becomes, what do we do with all this information? It's a lot, right? And that just means that we have a lot of work to do. And why what we say is important. And that really comes to our words. And these are the words of Maya Angelou, and I love these. Words are things. I'm convinced. I have to move this so I can see better. You must be careful about the words you use or the words you allow to be used in your house. I think they get on the walls, they get in your wallpaper, they get in your rugs and your upholstery and your clothes, and finally into you. So I really encourage folks to use your words and not your acronyms. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are real things. And that's really about knowing your audiences as well. Internally, we may talk about it as DEI, but when we use DEI externally or with our volunteers, it really is something that can be misunderstood or not understood and create a barrier between the folks that we are trying to reach and the content that we're talking about. So I use a whole variety of words and language when I'm talking or writing about these concepts. Things like our work is about reaching more people. Our work is about growing more gardeners, reaching deeper into our communities, really broadening across all interests of gardening, ensuring community reach, engaging with our neighbors, helping, growing, working side by side. And just a hat tip to Tim Kenny for having shared that with me. Connected, together, meeting people where they are. And it's really about widening the circle, and that there's a seat here in the Master Gardener program and in gardening for everyone. So in general with our words, things to think about, and just to really start to practice acknowledgement and identification here is that looking at gender and pronouns, that we don't necessarily need to use he and she, but we can use they. In fact, they was the 2019 word of the year. Be careful around the words that we use for race and ethnicity. And that includes socioeconomic, as well as mental health and abilities, and nationality, age, religion. Be careful with boomers, and millennials, and how we label and identify people. And really, this is a different kind of change for us to think about, but avoid any other categories that feed into power dynamics or otherness. And that really comes into land ownership or assumption of land, your garden and your yard versus the garden and the yard. You know, communication also means about framing, and how do we frame talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity? There's understandable ways and plain language that we can use when we talk about it, and framing allows us to do that. One of the ways that I've been writing about that and talking about it is something that we as gardeners, all gardeners know, that biodiversity makes a garden stronger. And why wouldn't that be the same with people? Another element around framing is inclusion. The concept of inclusion is something that a lot of master gardeners know and understand. You know, that's about mentorship and sharing the space and room with others. It's the same kind of idea that as seasoned master gardeners know, that to mentor new master gardeners, that we know that really good mentors share that space, right? And that there's so much space to share in gardening. Be really clear of your intentions. And that means use the tools and the forms that are in place to support the work that we're doing. It's not personal. University statements on our responsibility to equity. We have official extension statements on diversity, equity, inclusion. We can point to our departmental statements and commitments. We have the civil rights mission of the USDA. It would be great to know if the EMG or EMGNC has an official statement or commitment that would also support this work. Signed agreements with volunteers from the get-go, from the start, from orientation are very helpful through this ongoing work. Make sure that you have a mission and vision that's updated and defined. Define your priorities of your program and use them as guiding visuals on all materials. And when we talk about priorities, I think Missy spoke yesterday about these areas of buckets, but this is the big impact. What's our focus of our work and the impacts that we make? And that can come by defining our priorities. And then just really develop a clear value statement that these are guiding principles, or I also think of it as a manifesto, something that master gardeners can really rally around and be proud of internally and externally. So we are approaching our diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Master Gardener program in Oregon in 3 ways: ourselves and our own work, who and how master gardeners serve in the community, and then third, systemic within the program. So ourselves and our own work, some of that you heard from Gail as far as attending an Oregon Humanities program to learn about racial history of Oregon. Our own histories, our own stories, we're doing personal work, reading a lot, listening to a lot of great podcasts, understanding the history of racism in Oregon, and looking at what are the founding stories of land-grant institutions, what maybe we talked about 10 years ago, but what we look at now as the truth of the land-grant institutions and their founding. We're looking deep into our field. I recently wrote about the colonization of the naming of plants, and learning to acknowledge that this has been happening a very long time. All of this work improves our critical consciousness in helping us to become more aware of inequities as we come upon them, as they're presented, as we see them, as we start to look at our program. Secondly, we're looking at who and how we serve. How are we currently serving our communities and our neighbors? How far are we reaching into our communities, or are we just talking to ourselves? Who are we missing? Who needs gardening advice and support and education? What do we know about our county demographics? Have we mapped locations of our demonstration gardens and our event locations with our community? And what partnerships do we have in the community to do the work that we're doing? And then third, systemic within the Master Gardener program. And as you can see, we have a lot of questions. What does it mean to be a Master Gardener? Who's the training program designed for? What barriers are inherent within the program? Can we remove these barriers? And then what coursework do we have that contradicts cultural beliefs and traditions, and how do we confront that? So I want to talk about really looking at who and how we serve in the community. Can we move beyond our smaller circles where we only look for the community to come to us? And instead, can we go out and serve our communities? And one way to do that is to develop really strong and diverse community partnerships. That's vital to our mission to communicate our impact, and it will grow our work tremendously. So I have an example for you of a case study of a project that was here in Multnomah County, which is the Portland area. And it started, you'll see there's one little logo down there at the bottom, and that's the logo for the OSU Master Gardener program in Multnomah County. And that started with a project with a Master Gardener named Dennis Brown. It's smoky here. He is a committed Master Gardener, and he really gets and understands the role of Master Gardener as education, as community connector. And he had a phone call from our friends at the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. And they're a unit of local government. They work to keep the water clean, conserve water, keeping soil healthy. They're an elected board. They do conservation projects, and they offer grants. And he had an existing small relationship through Master Gardener with someone at Soil and Water Conservation. But it turns out that they had a phone call. They had been, from their friends, the June Key Delta Community Center, which is owned and operated by the Portland alumna chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. So this community center, and you can see it there on the screen, it's in a historically Black neighborhood across from Portland's Peninsula Park Rose Garden, which is one of my favorite rose gardens in Portland. The site was a 1960s gas station that was converted into a living building using sustainable building practices. And the property includes an educational garden. And the folks who are the owners and folks who run the community center there, it's owned and operated by the Portland alumna chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. It's a Black Greek organization that was first formed in Portland in the 1940s. So at the same time, you've got to stay with me here because there's a lot of partners here. At the same time, Dennis was working with the Oregon Food Bank. The Oregon Food Bank is our statewide folks who collect and distribute food through a statewide network, and they run a program called Seed to Supper. And Seed to Supper is an existing program that OSU Extension has developed in conjunction with the food bank. It's a free beginning gardening course that teaches tools to start a garden and to grow food on a budget. It's an actual program that is distributed through the local food banks, but it is taught and led by Master Gardeners throughout the state. It really is our primary tool for reach into underserved communities. And it also attracts a value-based Master Gardener. So it has a magnetic quality to it. So he was working with them because they were doing a program, or starting to figure out how to do a program with VOS, which is the Workers' Rights Education Project. And they empower day laborers and immigrants to improve working conditions and protect civil rights through leadership development and organizing. So day laborers are temporary workers. Many of them are immigrants or homeless, or they're veterans. They were formed in response to ICE raids on the intersections where day laborers would gather on Portland street corners. So the Oregon Food Bank was doing Seed to Supper. Dennis was sitting in and working with them on that. The thing about the program with VOS was that they had no demonstration or education garden or a site to do any hands-on learning. And Dennis started to put together the fact that, well, June Key needs physical help, not just a demonstration garden, but the whole site needed landscaping. So he started to put these things together, and he wrote a small grant to our friends at the Soil and Water Conservation District for the VOS folks to get hands-on learning how to deal and how to work with native plants. Is it a weed or is it a native plant? Also, they learned how to do vegetable gardens, and that ended up being a skill set that they could use for getting work, and being able to say that they have experience in working with vegetable gardens. The grant also allowed a stipend to pay the workers and also for supplies. And then, as this all came together, we had additional folks that came in. Metro is our regional government. They help provide Spanish instruction with support. And then we had the city's Bureau of Environmental Services. We had AmeriCorps folks that were pulled into it. So you can see how one master gardener was able to pull all of these partnerships together to reach an audience that we have very little reach with and into. So talking to Dennis, these were some of the things that he talks about as far as success for doing a project around partnerships, that you have to have relationships with really committed community partners. The relationships come from asking, what can we do, versus coming up with the ideas and the plans ourselves. Gene Key Delta and the Soil and Water folks knew what they wanted, and they knew who they were serving. That we need to constantly foster connections and partnerships and leverage existing partnerships. Community groups have trusted relationships with their constituents. We can write grants for innovative projects, and we can report outcomes. And, really having a sense of flexibility, jumping in, don't center yourself, but you can be the connector and the guide and the folks who report back. So for communications, what's really important is that when we do this work, that we're shining a light on this good work. We need to focus and feature and highlight the work that we're doing with community partners, that when we do that, we can really let it become a magnet to attract new master gardeners, to communicate what our priorities are from the program, and for the community to see themselves in our programming. It's so powerful for people to see themselves reflected. So when it comes to shining a light on this good work, feature stories of partnership projects and newsletters, highlight innovative programs in our annual reports. How do we really cultivate a storytelling culture where we share the stories of our good work? Do we start every meeting sharing the impact of a project that finished up this last month? Questions around how do we really incorporate that? Rotate stories of partnership on our website. Social media was built for communicating stories like this. Revise or develop new award programs. For example, California has Gardeners with Heart, where they use metrics of impact versus metrics of hours or amount of people that attended. And then when we share those stories, again, shining the light, we are able to communicate what is the priority for the program, and people see themselves reflected. So communicate consistently and repetitively your values and your program priorities. And then finally, stay the course. The work of diversity, equity, inclusion is never over. It's like when my wife asked me some years back, are we done with the garden yet? I was just like, oh, honey, no, we're not. It's never over. It's the same thing with diversity, equity, inclusion. It's not ever going to be over. But there's going to be a really broad range of response to this kind of work. And remember that one person's comment is only one person's comment. Right now, today, we are in a very highly politicized moment in time, and people are on the edge and recognize that. Take time when you have a comment to respond to reflect and respond thoughtfully and officially. If you're confronted on the spot, look for allies who can help echo your key talking points. Consistently refer to your university's official statements. Make it clear that it's not political. We are fulfilling the requirements set forth by our organizations and our institutions. And really stay in the conversation, but know where the line is for hate speech or for threats. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both so much. I just was sitting here just thinking about how important and how special it is to have both of you here sharing this with us. And I think, Missy, we have some great comments and program ideas and questions, and I even have one myself. So I'll let Missy take over here with moderating a little bit.
All right, you got it. Well, first and foremost, Gail and LeAnn, thank you so much. You have a ton of praise coming from your colleagues nationally about how you've presented this topic, the work you're doing in Oregon, and the fact that it's very inspiring to all of us. So thank you. I hope you can take a moment to read the comments at some point during the course of the day. We have a couple of, I think, great questions that have also had a little bit of dialogue in the chat here. Let's see, Yvette asks, where would you start in order to do this type of research for your state? And this question was posed while Gail was speaking. I think, Gail, if you could address, you know, we had some conversation in the chat about where to get information about the history of the land where your institution is located, also racial exclusion history, but where did you start? What was your process in Oregon? And then how did you collect the demographic information for your volunteers?
So to find out more about the history of land use or land tenure in your state, I would turn to your social science colleagues at your university. Many of them are wonderful resources for this type of information, and particularly in this time and day have taken a leadership role in helping all of us understand context for why we're at where we're at today. I also sought out opportunities to find the information. Like I said, just keeping aware of seminars and presentations that are being held at your university or at adjacent universities, reading broadly. There have been some great articles written recently in High Country News about where the land from land-grant universities has come from and how it's not a great story in most cases. And so I would say there are lots of opportunities to learn. Just really be proactive in seeking them out. And your social science colleagues, honestly, they've just been so wonderful to learn from here at Oregon State. And how do we survey our volunteers? We actually did a mail survey to all master gardeners on our master list of volunteers back in 2007 and just asked them to self-identify their race. So you'll notice that if you looked at our numbers, they didn't add to 100%. That's because about 5% of folks chose not to answer that question.
Great, thank you so much for the additional information, Gail. I do want to call attention to some conversation in the chat. Megan from Delaware has a wonderful, rich history of partnership that she shared between Delaware State University and the University of Delaware. Delaware State University is a 1980s historically Black land grant institution. They've partnered with University of Delaware, and together they are the Delaware Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Program. They've got some, Megan shared a great statistic about the demographic in that program. Also from Washington State University, Jennifer shared that she's doing study circles using the Facing Racism curriculum from Coming Together for Racial Understanding. I think she's posted a link and some more information to where we can get that information. I do have another question for LeAnn and Gail. Could you please elaborate on barriers built into the Master Gardener program as it exists, especially what you mentioned about training topics?
So we actually, as a smaller group, had been working on identifying systemic barriers to participation in our program since about 2016. And really it comes down to time and money. And so we're looking at ways to make things more accessible. In terms of training topics, LeAnn has been very thoughtful about this. I think that it's important, and I kind of refer to it casually when we very proudly put out there that we're a research-based organization. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of research, particularly in the natural sciences, has been based upon the appropriation or the exclusion of knowledge developed by indigenous cultures. And especially as we're starting to delve more into this work, let's say like garlic mustard is an invasive plant. And so we teach about invasive plants and that they have negative impacts on local ecologies and local economies. Well, in some cultures, some of those plants that we consider to be invasive weeds are actually important for cultural ceremonies or have a specific cultural meaning. So I think that just broadening our understanding of what we present and hold up there as being research-based, that it could have different meanings to different cultures and different communities. And LeAnn, I don't know if you have more to say about that.
Great, thank you both very much. I'm going to turn it over to John if you'd like to ask your question.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, and thank you, Gail and LeAnn, so much for presenting this topic today in such a fantastic way and a clear way. And mine has to do with technology and the fact that we are delivering all of our programs, it seems, by technology. What kind of new and unique barriers do you think that would present for us as we try to reach underserved audiences that we haven't reached before? And so I just would be interested in your thoughts on that particular topic.
I think it's a good question. And in some ways, I'd say that as far as reducing barriers, it actually can be really good in that, you know, for folks who have multiple jobs, who need to access recordings or information, you know, during the middle of the night or, you know, in times that we don't hold them, or access and transportation, that it actually can, we can say that and look at how it increases accessibility that way. You know, looking at it and knowing that one tool is not the solution, and that, again, biodiversity in the garden, it's the same thing with tools. As many different tools as we can use, and experiment and find and test, you know, what are the tools that are reaching folks. So I know that I think Elizabeth Records has been talking about doing a broadcast for folks that don't have access to broadband or to internet, and being able to do a radio broadcast is reachable. You know, that's one of the tools that we're looking at. So just knowing that one tool is not the end solution there.
We've also talked, John, for us, the lack of connectivity is a big issue in rural populations. So we've talked about going back to the old correspondence course method of creating packets that we can send to folks so they can self-study and send it back to be graded. Of course, all of these things take different time and effort, and a lot of time and effort to get off the ground.